excellent. So you can correct me if I say anything silly. So let's get started. So like I said, I like to start from a more theoretical background and kind of explaining what functions visualization is supposed to do, and in a sense, what systems it's tapping on in your cognitive apparatus, let's say. So we're going to start by looking at human perception, so how we actually see things, and how that, in a sense, impacts the way we interpret what we see, and how we should take that into account when we're designing our visualizations. Then we're going to move on the second stage to the fundamentals and the basic ideas of visualization, kind of as a science in a sense. Then we start working with Matplotlib, where I explain the structure of Matplotlib and how you can use it to generate relatively simple plots. Then move on to style sheets that allows you a sense to design your own style for your own figures, so you don't have to customize everything by hand every single time. Finally, some mapping examples, so how you can use geographical information. And then finally, at the end, I'm going to talk about Seaborn, which, as I mentioned, kind of builds up and it's organized as a wrapper around the Matplotlib functionalities. So in practice, anything you see that's done with Seaborn can also be done with Matplotlib. You just have to build it, in a sense, from scratch. Well, Seaborn makes your life much easier, and it kind of gives you a lot of, let's say, syntactic sugar to make things simpler and more accessible. So, part one, human perception. So, as you know, our senses are only capable of capturing one part of the information that we receive, right? There is a limited range of colors we're able to see, the visible spectrum, and there is also a limited range of frequencies we're able to hear. So there are sounds that we can't hear when other animals can. For instance, dogs can hear much lower frequencies than we can, or much higher frequencies than we can, while we are much more restricted. And in a sense, from my perspective at least, the goal of visualization somehow is to translate phenomena that we're not able to capture directly by our senses and translate them into a format which we are able to process. And this idea where, in a sense, it is translating information, it's representing information in the way that's better accessible to our senses. It's not a new idea. It's something that's been around for a while. And it's also something that limits how, or should help shape how we design our visualizations and how we design our representations. Also, depending on what sense we're using, we can also see that there is a limited amount of information that it's able to process. And here, this sort of cartoon kind of makes the comparison between the bandwidth, quote unquote, of senses and what, excuse me, the bandwidth of other information tools you might be familiar with. So sight would be equiparable to the internet or a computer network, and that's the biggest bandwidth, in the sense that it's able to receive the most information per unit time. Right after you have touch, which is the second fastest information processing, which is roughly equivalent to a USB port. Hearing and smell is roughly the same speed as a hard drive, and taste is this slowest and the most limited one. So what this means is that one of the reasons, excuse me, to use visualization is that we are able to process very quickly a lot of information. Right? In a sense, evolution provided us with eyes and a visual cortex in our brains to be able to quickly to quickly produce and process a large array of information in a very small amount of time. Of course, this was done for evolutionary purposes, so we can react whenever we see a predator, when there is some danger. But it's something that we can co-opt, in a sense, and take advantage of to process other kinds of information that are much more valuable in our daily lives, in our modern worlds. And in particular, there are strong limitations about what we are able to process and how the way things are represented actually impacts our processing ability. Right? So researchers have done experiments, and they've measured this experimentally, that in order of ease of understanding, of ease of processing, we have position and length. So we're very good at distinguishing where things are located with respect to one another and how far apart they are or how long they are. Right after that, so slightly worse job we can do is distinguishing directions and angles and even areas. Even below that, we have a harder time with volumes, curvatures, and shades. And then finally, the worst kind is the color saturation. Right? So what this means is that when we are designing visualization, we should be able to take this into account, and we should take advantage of the fact that some kinds of information are more easily processed. So we should rely more, for example, on positions and lengths than on curvatures and volumes. It's one of the reasons why many visualization experts tend to dislike, let's say, or be against using three-dimensional visualizations just for flashy purposes, right? Without any good reason to use them. So now we're going to look at a few examples. So here, for instance, we have a nice classical example comparing pie plots with bar charts. So we have two rows. The top row has the pie plots. The bottom row has the bar charts. You have the same information, so the same numbers in both rows, and each column kind of has a different set of data, let's say. And what you can see here is that it's much easier to distinguish in the bar charts which bar is longer, which value is larger, than it is in the pie charts. Right? With the pie charts, you're relying on areas and angles, while in the bar chart, you're relying only on length, right? And as we saw, length is much more easily distinguishable than angles. So this is also one of the typical arguments that people will use to say that you shouldn't use or you should avoid pie charts because it's very hard to distinguish between relatively similar angles. Here another example is a simple illusion where you actually have only three colors in the whole plot. You have blue, yellow, and red, but depending on what the background color is, you can see how the colors actually look different. So you can see how, for example, the blue lines crossing through the red rectangle look darker than the blue background, even though it's the same blue, right? Because we're influenced, and our brain is influenced not only by the color of an object, but also by its environment and what's surrounding it. So we look also particular to not the absolute color, but how that color relates to what's around it. So we look more in the sense that differences in color than the color itself. And that actually leads to some very nice optical illusions that you that you can easily find online. So here to emphasize a little bit that the idea that context actually matters, right? And it's not just you evaluate things not by themselves, but also by their surroundings. So here we have another nice example with the circles, and it might not appear like it, but the two orange circles on the top figure are actually the same size, right? the reason why the orange circle surrounded by large gray circles looks smaller is because we're perceiving it in comparison with the other large circles, so it seems much smaller. On the other hand, on the right-hand side of the same figure, the orange circle seems much larger because it's larger than the gray ones around it, so that makes it appear larger. Right? And actually, yeah. So you can see how I put two horizontal white lines there to make it clear that the two circles are actually the same. On the other hand, our eyes somehow also have a tendency and evolved over time to find patterns, to find meaning in shapes. Right? So you can see, for example, in the triangle figure, that our eyes kind of fill in a white triangle overlapping the other shapes, even though there is no actual triangle there. It's just that the slices that are missing on the three circles are aligned in a way to make it look like there is a triangle. Right? Also, you don't actually have the black triangle, rather the black edged triangle in the background. You just have three angles, but again, that they are aligned in a way to make our eyes see a triangle, even though it's not there. And the final example, you have the two arrows, and again, you can guess what I'm going to say next. You can see that the horizontal line of the two arrows is actually the same. Right? The reason why the top line seems smaller is because you have the arrows pointing out, while the bottom line seems longer because the arrow heads, in a sense, are pointing in. Right? And you can see that when, again, I draw two vertical parallel lines, and you can see that the two horizontal lines are actually the same, and also the two circles as we've seen already. On the other hand, we also have this example here, where if you try to focus on any specific part of this figure, it seems like the lines are kind of crisscrossing and angled. And I'll show you actually how to generate this figure in Matplotlib, and you can see that all we have here are rectangles and horizontal lines. There are no oblique or inclined lines. Everything is perpendicular and parallel. And the illusion is created by the subtle way in which the black rectangles are misaligned with one another, that makes our eyes kind of interpret the line in a different way, because that kind of would be and would correspond to the way things would be aligned in nature, right? So this is kind of one of the important points to make, is that our eyes and our cognitive systems and our visual cortices kind of evolved in a very specific environment, like in nature, right, where things happen in a specific way, and now we're trying to use them in a very artificial context, in a context where, in a sense, there are no limitations to what we can do, right? We can draw, we can represent anything that strikes our imaginations, and so our perceptions that evolved to work in the natural context, where it was perfectly fine to take certain shortcuts if that made you react faster or perceive something faster, are ill-equipped in some contexts, in some applications that we're using them now, because the same assumptions don't work anymore. For instance, one interesting thing is that our eyes, the way that they work, actually only see a very small area at each time. And the way we fill in the whole field of vision is that our eyes are constantly moving, right, and changing their attention. And it's that constant movement that we don't even perceive it consciously that explains why we see the lines shift, because when our eyes move looking at the image, the rectangles that it sees are slightly aligned in different ways, and that kind of gives us the illusion that the lines are moving, the horizontal lines are moving or that they're deformed in some way. So to make things a little bit clearer, so this is what a human eye looks like, and you kind of have light coming in on one side, being focused by a lens, and collected in the retina, in the back of the eye. As we move our eyes and we move our excuse me, our irises and the lenses, we can kind of focus the light in different parts of the retina and kind of adjust what we're seeing. But the back of the retina, what it has essentially is two types of cells. You have, or at least the most important two types of cells, which are rods and cones. The rods are responsible for seeing or capturing, let's say, black and white, so how much light you're actually getting, so quantifying the amount of light you're receiving, while the cones help you perceive different colors. And in fact, there are essentially three types of cones. You have red cones, green cones, and blue cones. And you have one type of rods, which just give you black and white, right? They have light intensity in a sense. And one interesting thing is that the blue cones, the green cones, and the red cones, and you recognize these letters RGB rather, as the color coding that used in computer screens. And this is why, because we have cells that are specifically designed to perceive these colors. But you can see that even though they're called red, green, and blue, they don't just capture one specific wavelength. So they have one wavelength that they're the most sensitive to. So 420 nanometers for blue cones, so they're called blue. 534 for green cones, 564 for red cones. And for us to perceive other colors, effectively what happens is that we will excite these different cells to different intensities. So let's say, for example, that we receive a photon or a piece of light at with a wavelength of 500 nanometers, right? So roughly in the center of the image. On one hand, our rods will be at maximum excitation, so they'll be the most sensitive. This is their preferred frequency. On the other hand, right behind them will be the green cone, so we'll perceive it as a lot of green, perceive it as a little bit of red, and a tiny bit of blue. So, and what this means is that even though we're only seeing one specific wavelength, 500 nanometers, we're perceiving it as being a combination of three other colors, right, in different proportions. And this actually is interesting. It actually explains why our computer screens are able to work, is because we can have little cells, or little pixels rather, in the screen tuned to the different colors, and by adjusting the intensity of each of the colors, you can make your eyes see all the visible spectrum, even though you don't actually reproduce all the visible spectrum. So you can actually invert the picture a little bit, and if you want to make me see a color which is 500 nanometers wavelength, so somewhere between the cyan and the green, this is what you do. You would give it a little bit of blue, a little bit of red, and a bit of green, and my brain would naturally combine these three inputs to see that cyan green color in the middle. And of course, the reason why we're specially tuned to these specific colors is obvious. You have blue in the sky and the ocean, you have green in grasses and trees, you have red in the sunset or the sunrise. Also, red tends to be associated with danger when you bleed, for example. So these are colors that weren't, of course, chosen by accident, is because they correspond to something in nature. And the way you combine the different colors, of course, results in many other colors. And influences how you perceive things. Of course, because a lot of this is interpreted and processed by your brain, in a sense, it's also to some degree culture dependent. Right? So what I'm showing here is a chart that basically tells you how different people classify different colors. And the way this works was essentially like a little online game where you would be shown a color and you would have to type, okay, how would you describe this color, right? And here what they're showing is the RGB space divided by the names that people would give to those colors. So you can see the blue corresponds to this large area. Green is another large area. You have teal somewhere in the middle, and then you have smaller subdivisions in different parts of the spectrum. So you have, for instance, brown sitting between green and red, orange between red and yellow, and so on. And the point I'm trying to make here, in a sense, is that there is no clear, well-defined distinction between where one color ends and another one begins, right? So what one person might call blue, another person might call purple, right? And vice versa. And this also impacts not only how we perceive things, but also how much attention we give to things, right? So it's not so much that, and this will take us a little bit in a tangent towards linguistics, but there is this idea in linguistics that your language kind of impacts the way you think, right? And it's not exactly that. It's more that your language kind of reflects the things you pay attention to, and the things you pay attention to are impacted by the language you use. So if you have no reason to distinguish between green and blue, it's very likely that you'll never call something teal. Right? You'll either call it green or you'll call it blue, depending on which side of the divide it is. While if you are in a situation or in a culture that takes advantage of many different colors and many different combinations of colors, you're much more likely to have a more refined, let's say, or more nuanced division of where one color begins and another one ends. So this brings us to the idea also of how we represent the different colors. So here we have the color wheel, and you can see how it's building up on the RGB division that I mentioned. So you have red, green, and blue, kind of the primary colors, and all the others coming out as different combinations of these three colors. Right? So as you go around the circle, you can move from red to yellow, green, cyan, blue, and magenta, with many other colors in between. But also, one important thing to keep in mind is that you also have that fourth dimension, right? You have the dimension of the rods, right? The hue of the color, in a sense. So you have, no, not really the hue, but kind of like the brightness of the color. So you have, on the outside, you have the hues, so which are the actual colors with full brightness, let's say. Right below that, you have tints. If you go a little bit darker, then you have tones, when you're combining, in a sense, the original color with gray, while tints would be the color plus white, so they're a lighter version. Tones would be a darker version, and then shades are the color plus black, so it's an even darker version. So you can see how this corresponds, in a sense, to different combinations of white light, or absence of white light, and the actual color. Naturally, and for cultural reasons, we also tend to classify colors in different ways. So you have warm colors that we tend to associate with warmth or heat. So you have yellow, red, orange, so things associated with fire and the sun. You have cold colors, blue, green, purple, which naturally correspond to the colors you might see in ice, or your hands turning purple because you're cold, and so on. So you see how our perceptions and our intuitions kind of impact the way we perceive things and the way we define things. But in a more practical sense, this also gives us a nice way of defining our color schemes. Because we have this natural way of organizing colors and of how the colors relate to one another that reflects in the way we perceive colors, we can use this as a way, take advantage of this rather, as a way of emphasizing some distinctions or some trends. So if you want to make it clear that one thing is very different from the other, you might use a complementary color scheme, right? So with colors that sit on opposite ends. So these, and your brain will naturally perceive these as being very different things. If you need more than one color on each side, you can have a rectangle type color scheme where you have two colors that are relatively close to one another and two other colors that are further apart. You have an analogous scheme where you kind of have a natural sequence of colors, natural progression. So from green to blue-green to blue. You can have a triadic or a square color scheme which allows you to distinguish between 3 or 4 separate things, because again, the colors will be very different. Or if you want to have, you can even combine these different types of color schemes, and you can have, for instance, like a split complementary, where you have two things that are relatively similar to one another, and one that you're trying to emphasize to show that it is different. Right? So here we have the example of the red velvet and the blue violet, which would be seen as relatively similar, and then the yellow, on the other hand, which would be naturally seen as different. So you could use the yellow as a way of highlighting something on the red velvet and blue violet background. So this gives you a simple way of picking out your color schemes and picking out the colors that you're going to use in your visualization. One important note, and this is not terribly important for our purposes, but it might be useful for you at least to have some idea about this, is that there's actually two different color systems. Right? The one we're talking about so far is the RGB, which is known as the additive color system. And this, we're discussing it specifically because it relates to light and how we perceive things. You have the complementary one, which is called the subtractive color scheme, or CMYK, and this is the colors you would use in your printer. Right? And here, you're not building up the colors by adding light. You're building up the colors by adding inks of specific colors. So you're by subtracting light. Right? So one would be an additive color scheme, like RGB. The other one is the subtractive color scheme by CMYK. And this is why, depending on what you're using, if you add up all the colors of an additive color scheme like RGB, you end up with white. If you add up all the colors on the subtractive color scheme like CMYK, you end up with black. Right? Because on one hand, you're adding up the light from different sources, and on the other one, you're removing all the light from all the different sources. And just another quick note about how colors and cultures are kind of related to one another. What you have here is on top, you have kind of a spectrum. So this is kind of related to the names of the colors I mentioned before. So you have a little color spectrum, and some Berkeley anthropologists essentially went around the world to different cultures of indigenous people and kind of asked them the same kind of question. They asked them, okay, what would you call this color, right? What would you call this? What would you call that? And so on. And what they did is they built up another chart that represents the way things are referred to. And you can see how different cultures in different places. So here we have Panama, Brazil, Papua New Guinea, and Ecuador will pick up on different distinctions, right? So for instance, while in Brazil, a lot of what we'd call dark blues and dark oranges and yellows would just be called black. Most of all the light colors would be called yellow, and a bunch of the purples and reds would just be called red. While in Ecuador, for example, on the bottom right-hand corner, you would have a large chunk, all the blues would, or a large chunk of the blues would be referred to as green. Some of the violets would then be identified as blue, and so on. And you can see how, in a sense, the culture is influencing how you distinguish things and the things you pay attention to. Right? So to make the point, someone who sees, let's say, the very light blue on top and the very dark blue on the bottom as being the same blue, I just call them blue, probably wouldn't pick up or wouldn't be as sensitive to visualization or to an image that would focus on the distinction between these two shades, right? Where using this shade probably wouldn't be as meaningful to them. So if you're making visualizations and representations for a wide audience, this might be something to take into account. There's another famous example of it in Japan, for cultural reasons. They actually refer to the green light in a traffic light as being blue. Right? They actually use the word for blue for that because originally it was in a shade of green that they associated with actually being blue instead of green. Right? Now, of course, they standardized it to international standards, so it's a lot greener than it used to be, but it's still referred to as being blue. So I said, so the culture that your audience is a part of should be taken into account when you're doing these things. On the other hand, you also have other problems like color blindness, where because of differences in the way your cones and rods are shaped, let's say, you will perceive things in different way. This affects a few percent of the human population, a stronger emphasis on men instead of women. So, but here to give you a few examples. So this is a picture from a little girl in Cambodia in a temple a few years ago. And what you have here is basically how the same image, which is here in the center, would be perceived by someone with a different kind of color blindness. So there's 8 major kinds. So I kind of arranged them in this 3x3 grid with the quote unquote normal vision in the center and the different variants surrounding it so that you can actually see the difference, right? So you have things like a chromatopia where essentially people just see black and white, and other things like trinitopia where they tend to see a lot more red, for example. So to make things a little bit clearer, so this is a couple of charts I stole from the Wikipedia page, and it kind of highlights how, depending on which rods or which cones you have, that will impact your vision and the way you see it. Right? You can have a quote unquote normal or an anomalous red cone or a green cone or a blue cone, and that will impact what you see. Most about 92% of people have what's called normal vision. So there's about 8% that have some type of anomalous vision. And you can see also in the bottom how that changes the spectrum and the way they perceive the spectrum, right? So the most common one is the pteranomaly, which is a funny word, that kind of puts the emphasis on the red and the blue and makes you much less likely to perceive the green, right? So you have a harder time distinguishing anything that relies on green, for example. So you might have problems in the traffic light distinguishing the red light from the green light, especially if they're not in the usual sequence, right? Where you can see that the top is always red, the bottom is always green. Right? So that might cause problems. The chromatopsia, as we mentioned, that has no cones at all, so you only have rods, so you only see black and white, and so Of course, because of this, people have come up with different color schemes that are specifically optimized to be able to be perceived by the different types of color vision. So the most famous one that's meant to be perceptually correct across the widest possible range of types of vision is known as the Viridis color scheme. And you can see, and here I'm showing you the entire color scheme in the center as before as being the original one, and then the different variants around it. And you can see how in some of them it's much easier to distinguish between different ranges and different areas of the spectrum than in others. So again, if you're working for a large audience, this is something you might want to take into account. This is one of the things I do if I'm trying to publish some type of visualization. I'll generate a little plot like this where I have the original figure in the center and then the different variants around it to make sure that it still transmits the idea that I'm trying to transmit. Right? Still shows enough detail that will be perceived by my target audience. Of course, there's also a wide range, a wide number of online services that allow you to easily choose color schemes and to see colors side by side. A very nice one is Color Hunt that lets you see from thousands and thousands of different sets of colors that you can pick, and then you can get the RGB code or whatever code you want to generate the same colors. You also have I Want Hue that makes it especially easy to pick colors under certain constraints. So you can see colors that are specifically designed for color to be easily perceived by colorblind people, to be specifically easy to distinguish from a dark background and so on. So you can impose any constraints, and that kind of limits the choice of colors you have, and then you can select the colors you want to create your own palette. You have Picular, which is kind of a search engine for colors. So you enter a description and it will show you a sequence of colors. So the little rectangles you see on the right-hand side are actually moving up. And as you type the description, so dark, warm, green, it will select the colors that you will see there. So you can click on them and get their description. A more visual and fun one is Color Code. And here what it does is as you move the mouse, you're kind of moving around in color space. So it's changing the color that you're seeing in the background of the image. And whenever you click on it, it will fix that color and start letting you choose another one. So you can build up a color scheme by essentially moving around in color space and manually selecting the color you like and seeing them all side by side. And finally, Color Lovers is another one, which gives you a nice, large selection of different color palettes that were built up and put together by their users, which a lot of them are graphic designers. And so it kind of allows you to see also what other people are using and what other people recommend, so you can get a better idea of what might be useful and what might be easily perceived and so on. Excuse me. So just a few thoughts on color theory and how you combine different colors and how the different colors should be used to transmit the message you're interested in. In particular, so there's 10 of them here. I'm gonna highlight a few of them. So first of all, as I tried to emphasize already, you should be familiar with the color wheel and how the different colors are related to one another. So that would be commandment 1. You should either match the colors, so find colors that are close by in the color wheel, or contrast them, find colors that are far apart in the color wheel, depending on what your goal is. So that would be commandment somewhere between commandments 2 and 3. Depending on your application, you could also use an achromatic or monochromatic chromatic scheme, like in commandment 8. And finally, if being able to distinguish between the hues and the tints and the shades is also important, and actually gives you a different idea and a very different can result in a very different image depending on what you're using, as we're seeing here in commandment 9. So this is the end of part 1, which is kind of like the more, let's say, theory-heavy section of this lecture. Before we start the next section, the one where we start looking actually on visualization, now we can put together these pieces that I mentioned into practical visualizations. I would suggest we take a small 10-minute break. So it's 8:49 on my watch. So see you back here at 8:59. If you have any questions, please add them to the Q&A widget, and I'll get to them as soon as I'm back. And I'll see you in 10 minutes.